feel like your English teacher sees symbolism where it's just really not there? I know I once had an English teacher who literally said that everything is symbolic. And personally, I think that's taking it way too far. Sometimes the curtains are just curtains. But if you're reading an allegory, it may actually be that everything is a symbol. In fact, that's basically what an allegory is. A story where all of the characters, events, and so on and so forth can only really be understood through the lens of symbolism. They lose most of their significance if you take it away. Allegories can take on many different forms. There are political allegories like Animal Farm, where, theoretically it's a story about a group of farm animals that overthrow the farmer and set up their own form of government. And the pigs kind of are in charge, but over time they become corrupt and oppressive in the same way that the farmer was. And you can understand it on some level just as a story about talking animals, but really it doesn't work very well unless you understand that it was Orwell's take on the Russian Revolution. And when you look at it through that lens as an allegory for the Russian Revolution and the subsequent communist government that followed, it's a completely different story and it's much more meaningful, and then you stop wondering, okay, so why is this a story about talking farm animals? Another really famous example of an allegory, this one is a religious allegory, is Pilgrim's Progress. The main character's name is literally Christian, and it's a story about basically the journey of living a Christian life. So he encounters various obstacles and meets other characters, and they're all incredibly symbolic. Aesop's fables are also sometimes given as an example of allegory. Obviously, they're much shorter and simpler allegories than something like Animal Farm or Pilgrim's Progress. But if you understand something like The Tortoise and the Hare as a story about those who work hard at a steady pace versus those who overexert themselves but then collapse from exhaustion or become lazy because they're so far ahead, you can kind of see how that works as an allegory. The Ant and the Grasshopper is another example. The ant is the hard worker who prepares for the future, and the grasshopper is the one who is lazy and only lives in the moment. They're characters in a story, but they don't really function just as characters in a story. They function as symbols for something else. So that brings me to the big question of today's video, which is, what about this? Is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and more broadly, are the Chronicles of Narnia religious allegories? My answer is no, but they come really, really close, and it's easy to understand why people might interpret them that way. So just to be clear, I am not saying there is no religious influence in the Chronicles of Narnia. There absolutely is. C.S. Lewis was a very devout Christian. He wrote a lot of works for adults, actually, that are Christian apologetics or theological works. And so, you can definitely see, I have actually read Mere Christianity among a couple of other of his works, and you can see the things that he talked about in there reflected very much in the Chronicles of Narnia. For instance, there's a moment in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe where Lucy's older siblings are asking Professor Kirk about her weird imaginings of what happened in the wardrobe. And he tells her that either Lucy is lying, Lucy is insane, or Lucy is telling the truth. He actually makes a very similar argument about religious faith and Jesus in Mere Christianity. He says that either Jesus was lying about who he is and what his purpose was on earth, he was insane, or he was telling the truth. He basically takes the attitude that you can't just view Jesus as a great moral teacher, but not a divine figure. It has to be one or the other. It has to be all or nothing, basically. And the plots of some of the books draw a lot of inspiration from the Bible, actually. The Magician's Nephew, for instance, is the story of how Narnia began, and Lewis's ideas about how his fantasy world would begin were very strongly influenced by how he thought the real world began. There's even a scene that involves a character being tempted to steal an apple, although in a very different context from in Genesis. The Last Battle kind of goes on the opposite end of that. His ideas about how Narnia would end are very clearly inspired by the Book of Revelation, although it's not like a play-by-play exact correlation. And then in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we have Aslan, who is basically the Narnian equivalent of Jesus, sacrificing his life to save an innocent person who made a mistake, basically, from a great evil. So it's not exactly like the story of Jesus on the cross, but it bears certain similarities that obviously come from C.S. Lewis's religious beliefs. So if all of that is the case, then why am I saying it's not an allegory? A couple of different reasons. First of all, C.S. Lewis himself said that it wasn't. Now, I don't think that the author gets the final say on everything, but I do think it's important to consider their intent, among other things. So C.S. Lewis did say that his primary intent was to tell a story rather than to convey a religious message, and the religious themes kind of worked their way in. But if we are to believe what he had to say about it, that wasn't the primary reason for telling the story. And secondly, because when you read them, I think that does ring true. Plenty of kids read the Chronicles of Narnia and don't understand the religious symbolism in it. If it were an allegory, it would be a lot harder to miss. I know that personally, when I first read the Chronicles of Narnia in, I believe it was 4th or 5th grade, it went all just way over my head, and I think that that's a pretty common experience for kids who read them without being told what they're meant to represent. And I was raised, going to Sunday school and praying at bedtime and being taught all about, I had like the Bible storybooks and whatnot as a kid. As an adult looking at them, I can see it, absolutely. But I think that there are also, while there are some characters and events that have a lot of religious significance, there are others that are more mundane and just imaginary. Like, I don't think Mr. Tumnus is meant to represent anybody in the Bible. And while The Magician's Nephew, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Last Battle draw a lot of inspiration from certain parts of the Bible, others really don't. Like, for instance, there are definitely religious implications in Prince Caspian. There are some definitely persecuted first century Christian vibes from the Narnians living in the forest and whatnot, but really the story is mostly imaginary and doesn't reflect a particular part of the Bible in the way that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for instance, does. Or at least, if it does, I haven't figured out which part yet. Same thing with Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There are definitely particular scenes or ideas or themes that are explored that reflect what C.S. Lewis was presumably thinking about in terms of his religious ideas, but you have to look a lot harder to find it, and it really is primarily the story of a fantastical journey at sea. So if it were an allegory, the characters would be primarily symbolic of someone or something else. The events would be difficult to understand outside of their symbolic purpose, and really overall, the purpose of the story would be to convey a message other than the literal story being told. Whereas I think with the Chronicles of Narnia, in every or almost every case, the primary purpose is to tell a story that would entertain children, with a strong secondary purpose being involved in, the themes and the symbolism and whatnot. So it's a very fine line, but I do think that the Chronicles of Narnia fall on the more fiction than allegory side of the line, whereas something like Animal Farm or Pilgrim's Progress falls more on the allegorical side of it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it to be helpful. If you liked this and you'd like to see more like it, feel free to subscribe. I post twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I talk about reading, writing, literary concepts, classic literature, study tips, college tips, and much more.